So welcome to the Violence, Values and the Brain, which has been organized by Professor Gretty Mirdal, who is the director of the Brain, Culture and Society program of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Paris, whose president is Sadi Lalou and scientific director Simon Luc. This project started by some years ago, 4 years ago, was started by Professor Isaac Fried when he was a fellow in the Institute. And he brought a challenge concerning what he called Syndrome E that he's going to present to you in a minute. During 3 years of work and discussions, 3 international interdisciplinary symposia were held in the Institute. Following this incredible work, gathering specialties from so many disciplines, a book was published by Odile Jacob, New York. And we want to thank Odile Jacob and Bernard Gottlieb from the edition that gave us this opportunity. And this book was launched only a few days ago and will be also presented to you. I will basically chair this webinar, meaning that I will have as a main job to tell the speakers that they cannot go over 15 minutes, and I will ring after 12 minutes a little song, but I have a co-chairman who is Professor Denis Paschansky. Denis is a historian and he's a great specialist, and I just want to mention that he published recently a very interesting book concerning the terrorist attack and the victims of this attack on 13th of November, 2015. And Denis will have some minutes after all the speakers have given their talks to give us his appreciation or ideas of what he heard this afternoon. We will have three speakers first: Isaac Fried, Susan Fiske, Bérangère Thiriou. Then we will have a 15-minute discussion time where we will give the discussion time to all the, not the speakers, but the audience, and that will be gathered by the chat system. So please send your messages, which will be gathered by Simon Luc. And then we will have Patrick Hargard, Leos Migrod, Gretty Mirdal, and then the little commentary by Denis Paschansky. I'd like to introduce immediately Professor Isaac Fried from UCLA and Tel Aviv University, who was the initiator of this program. And I want to say how fantastic it has been, not only for the Institute community, but all the participants, to have his ability to come and go from across the planet to follow this program for these 3 years. Thank you, Isaac. You have the floor.
I want to really thank you for this invitation. I must say the only disappointment is really not being able to actually be in Paris here at this time. I think this is a big loss, especially at the wonderful place, which is the Institute itself. So our topic today, or my topic, really concentrate on the brains that pull the triggers, really. Syndrome E, I labeled it then and now. But let me just go back to the origin of this work and this concept. Essentially, we have seen over and over again this same phenomena over the years, in Armenia in 1915, in Poland in 1941, in Cambodia in 1975, in Srebrenica in 1995, and in Rwanda in 1994. And of course, in Syria in 2014 and even now. So this repeating images of people at trenches or in trenches being shot by individuals who are aiming at them from above in many forms are a repeating phenomena essentially in history. And indeed, this phenomena and the emphasis on the perpetrators really as a topic of study was already pointed out by Saul Friedlander in 1989. He says most interpreters try to avoid the problem posed by the psychology of total extermination by concentrating exclusively on specific ideological motives or on institutional dynamics, but an independent psychological residue seemed to defy the historian. And there is sort of an unease of interpretation that we cannot but stem from the non-congruence between intellectual probing and the blocking of intuitive comprehension. I mean, we see something and yet we say, does it really exist or does it not? So there is really an uncanny sensation when we are actually facing with these problems of the perpetrators. You know, there's a recent book which really goes back to this very issue, The Ravine, by Wendy Lower, which was just published a couple of months ago. And really the author here concentrated on this single image, which I think portrays this very minute that we are all, you know, extremely agitated by, and yet we cannot really comprehend and understand what is going on here. This is a moment, you know, of 4 individuals essentially shooting at a woman, you know, who is holding her child, and in a moment she will be dead in the pit. You can see the smoke coming out, which is actually the previous shooting. So this was obviously a site of massive shooting. And what Wendy Lower did, she really went and tried to investigate this very minute, to identify both victim and each of the perpetrators, which was actually present at this minute. And this was in a place in the Ukraine, and Miropol. And in fact, you can see other, you know, horrible sights, you know, from that. In this very moment of what is happening here, really left me with a feeling of really trying to understand. And that's really what precipitated, you know, my initial thinking about this issue, of course, being influenced by major work, mostly, of course, by Christopher Browning, the seminal book, Ordinary Men, and of course, other accounts in following years, such as Jean Hatzfeld of the terrible killings in Rwanda. And of course, in the background, you know, all the, you know, what we cannot talk about in detail now, you know, the Milgram experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, you know, that in 1971, the Abu Ghraib prison reality not experiment that we have heard about. I Can Breathe, you know, that we are seeing, you know, in this time and in this age. So this is something that we need to understand. You probably will not, but at least this quest, you know, is continuing in my mind, and I think in the mind of many people. So this is why, you know, already over 2 decades ago, I was able to actually publish in the Lancet this hypothesis of syndrome E. And my main question was really, what is happening in this transformation of these seemingly non-violent people, or people with no history of violence? What is really at the core of this transformation? This was really the issue at hand. And I decided at that point to really look at it as a medical model And I try to understand first the symptomatology, and this is how I really approach it at the time. And again, I focus on this very single moment of what is happening here. You see here an individual shooting. There are two other guns on the left side. And there is really, I think what Friedlander looked at as a sense of uncanniness, really, that indeed triggered by uncertainty as to the true nature of the perpetrators. In Browning account, really 80%, of those people in Battalion 101, which he investigated, were actually participants in that massacre. Let me just see here. Okay, so those symptoms were essentially a compulsive repetitive of violence, obsessive ideation, perseveration, rapid desensitization to violence, diminished affective reactivity, hyperarousal, a sense of elation, with the totality of destruction, intact intellectual abilities such as language, memory, and problem-solving skill, compartmentalization, as an individual being able to conduct activities which are seemingly in cognitive states which are in conflict, normal family life, yet killing entire families, obedience to authority, and finally, a central element of this essentially being a group-dependent phenomena which really exist in groups. And indeed, the main concept from this pathophysiological model, which I tried to bring forward at the time, was what I called cognitive fracture. That is essentially a cessation to generate emotion appropriate to images conjured by certain categories and stimuli. That is a prefrontal cortex essentially functionally disconnected from lower centers. And this is what I call cognitive fracture. It was very different from a model of a primitive animal being unleashed in the human. On the contrary, it's really the human, the prefrontal, the most advanced centers of the human brain being essentially working hyperactively and not getting the necessary normal feedback from the lower centers, which would restrain such behavior in animal or in a brain which is not human. And again, those central structures that you can see here, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which is probably the center of this disconnection. Again, we are talking here about values and rules, and we'll talk today about values. The rule system, which sometimes is placed in the prefrontal cortex on the lateral aspect, and the value system in the medial prefrontal cortex, work by many individuals nowadays, really juxtaposes those two elements, which are sometimes in conflict and probably to an extreme extent in this syndrome. There is a simply effect which I try to emphasize, that there are probably physiological changes which are at the root. And today we do have tools to study, such in this study by Mollenberg and al., which really showed people playing, video games of actual killing in video, either civilians or soldiers, and they have seen really a change in the perception. When people were actually playing video games, killing soldiers, they were actually not even activated areas which have to do with perception of faces, but actually treated those faces as objects. And at the same time, those areas associated with guilt in the lateral prefrontal cortex, those areas were really not active during this kind of behavior. So basically, this is work which had wonderful opportunity to have many disciplines participating in these three sets of conferences in 2015, 2016, and 17, the brains that pull the triggers, where we actually try to approach this from a multidisciplinary approach, bringing not only neuroscience, but obviously social sciences, psychology, the legal profession, and other aspects. And essentially, the question which we raise and the question which I want again to raise today, and the main question is, how do ordinary individuals become capable of undergoing such extreme change in behavior to repetitive killers in groups? And can neuroscience dialogue really with the human and social sciences lead to new insights? And finally, can anything be really done to meet the challenge of prevention and containment? So these questions were dealt with in those three conferences and essentially gotten quite a positive review, even in Nature, rephrasing this question as what makes peaceful neighbors become mass murderers, and rephrasing our transformation, that striking transformation, as a kind of a kill switch, to which the human brain may be unfortunately vulnerable. And that really brings us to this book, which just came out, which summarizes this discussion by Odile Jacob Publishings. I'll just say very briefly that the book deals really with those three questions. One is really, are we dealing with mad people, with bad people? I mean, who are the perpetrators? The second question is, what happens when brains make decisions? What are really the substrates of this type of behavior? Can neuroscience have dialogue with other disciplines? And then, of course, prevention and containment, and finally, responsibility and judgment. I just want to take this opportunity to really bring the sad news that one of our dear colleagues, Emile Bruno, who participated very actively in the second conference, and you can see here his chapter, The Marionette Thread, how the tugs of empathy and dehumanization can lead to intergroup conflict. Emile has done wonderful work in this area, but unfortunately passed away last year due to an incurable illness. So our thoughts, of course, are with his families and with his friends. So I would just like to conclude here,
Yes,
bringing us to the present age, and just really try and think, where do we see this today? Are those trends obviously existing today? Or are we going to really follow the lead of Steven Pinker and saying that really the better angels really are in our nature and things are actually getting better? So with this statement and with this question, I will conclude, and thank you again for the opportunity to talk here. And I look forward to a very interesting afternoon.
Thank you very much, Isaac. I'd like now to ask Susan Fiske from Princeton University to present us with her ideas and facts. Please, Susan. Perfect.
So I'm honored to be here and quite humbled to be asked to address these monumental questions. But what I hope to do is to illustrate some of the ways that social neuroscience can inform our conversation about these issues. And I should say that I'm an amateur social neuroscientist. So these data are from the beginnings of the times that people were beginning to do social neuroscience, but I hope that there's some insight here to share. So the main point I want to make is to talk about some of really what are psychological mechanisms as represented in the brain and the ways that people dehumanize other people. If you get nothing else out of these 15 minutes, I would like you to get the message that dehumanization comes in different forms, but they're knowable and systematic. So we think about dehumanization as being a function of two dimensions. One is warmth, which is the dimension of the other person's or group's intent, and the other one is competence, their ability to enact it. So for example, when people are thinking about the in-group, and these are in-group people nominated by Princeton students, but all over the world, people see their own citizens and their own middle class as the in-group, and they express pride, and those are fully human beings to them. This is in contrast to different kinds of outgroups. So for example, the worst kind of outgroups in every country are people without a home, also drug addicts. And people express disgust toward these people, and as if they're talking about animals, particularly rodents and vermin. Many ethnicities fit into this quadrant. Mostly they're ethnicities that are wanderers, or for example, Roma in Europe, Bedouin travelers in the UK. So it depends on the country and its particular history who these people are. But there's something about not having a fixed address that makes other people particularly ruthless in dehumanizing these groups and seeing them as having no redeeming positive features. So these are groups that are low on both dimensions, but some groups are mixed. So older people and disabled people elicit pity because they're seen as being well-intentioned but incompetent. And they get objectified. So people take care of them, but don't treat them as fully human. They're objects, bodies to be taken care of. Very few ethnicities fit into this quadrant, most places, but occasionally that might be the case. And then finally, this is the quadrant that is the most dangerous and elicits genocide the most often. So groups that are seen as highly competent, but not well-intentioned, elicit envy, which is a very volatile emotion, and often groups that are outsider successful entrepreneurs in a given society, when there's social breakdown, they're the ones who are attacked. So in the United States at this time, for example, Asians are viewed that way, and we've had terrible violence toward Asian women just in the last few days. So this is a schematic of what I just said. What I want to do is concentrate on each of the outgroup quadrants and give you a picture of how the brain responds. If these are basic, there ought to be neural signatures associated with each. So let's start with envy. So the envy quadrant, the envied outgroups are seen as competent but cold. They don't have good intentions. Besides Asians currently in the United States, Jewish people have been viewed this way repeatedly in history and in current circumstances some places. So groups like this elicit schadenfreude. That is, so this guy has a yacht. He looks very happy about his yacht. And you think, just what happens if he steps backward a little bit? Well, he would fall in the water. You know, I see on my screen some of the other speakers smiling about this. You know, we wouldn't be sorry. We don't want to kill him, but not just yet, because there's not social breakdown. But envied people elicit particularly feeling good about their bad events and bad about their good events. And this is unique to this quadrant. So people will report this, but also psychophysiological data reflect it. So if you put EMG electrodes on people's faces, you can pick up people's tendency to smile. And what you see is that people smile at the good events of most groups, even the disgust outgroup, except for the envy outgroup, they smile more to their bad events. So this is a very direct indicator of a malicious pleasure at somebody else's bad events. Let's look at a contrasting category, that is the pity quadrant. So with pity, it's a different dynamic. When somebody is disabled, for example, they're seen as warm but incompetent. And the attitude toward them is sort of patronizing care of the body as an object. So they get pity only if they adhere to prescriptions, because it's a top-down kind of attitude. And they must not be at fault for their disability, or else they don't get pitied. So this gets us in the brain territory. The part of the brain that I'm going to talk about in the next remaining minutes is the medial prefrontal cortex. So the medial prefrontal cortex, it's a very reliable result. It's involved when people are thinking about other people's minds. And as a social psychologist, I'm particularly interested that this part of the brain is so easily activated when people think about what's going on in somebody else's mind. So for the pity quadrant, the MPFC comes online if people are contemplating whether the person is at fault for their disability. This is a very different dynamic from the low quadrant, or, well, I'll tell you that in a minute. Let me give you another example that may seem quite different, but it's not really that different. Women's bodies get objectified too, but and also in a patronizing way. And the medial prefrontal cortex is involved here too. So we showed people the kinds of photographs that you see below, men and women clothed or relatively unclothed. And what you see is that when we split the photographs between faces and bodies, people remembered the bodies, but not the faces of the women who were in bikinis. But they were not, so they were dehumanizing them in the sense that they didn't recognize their faces, but they did recognize the body only. And this is correlated with the MPFC being activated. So what you see is that sexism correlates, these are male viewers, correlates positively with remembering naked male bodies, but it correlates negatively with remembering the faces of the women who are bikini clad. So this is a form of dehumanization. For the sexist men, the more sexist they are, the more the MPFC fails to activate when they're looking at the women. Okay. So let me close here by talking about the most dehumanized group of all, which is the people who are homeless. This also applies to refugees and poor people generally. So a homeless person, I've already said the MPFC activates normally in social cognition, attributing intent. But maybe this isn't true so much for people who are homeless or refugees or disgusting to people. So the way that people behave when they encounter a person who appears to be homeless is they don't make contact. They don't look at the person in the face. They stay away from them as if they're feeling they might be contaminated. And what you see uniquely in this quadrant is disgust, as if they're seeing a pile of garbage. And what happens here is that of all the quadrants that we show people pictures of, the MPFC does not activate when they look at pictures of people who appear to be homeless. It's as if they're looking at a pile of garbage, and instead, other parts of the brain come online that are associated with disgust. So for me, this is the most dehumanizing spot for somebody to be in, is to be viewed as not even worthy of thinking about their minds. Okay, so I have a couple more minutes. What I want to talk about is how you can use these kinds of techniques to see what the value of people's lives is, depending on what part of this space they fit into. So there are two features to this. One is that high status people in general, so that would be the in-group, middle class people, also admittedly, rich people and professionals and outsider entrepreneurs, they're higher status than the other two quadrants. If you think about how insurance companies value a life, they value people who make money and who have status. And I'm going to argue that ordinary people do this too. But the particularly valued people are the in-group versus the most dehumanized out-group, the disgust quadrant. So we're going to use the trolley dilemma to judge value. So the trolley dilemma is like this. There's a trolley, a streetcar, out of control, going up the track. If it goes all the way to the end of the track, it will kill 5 people. Joe is standing on an overpass, and he can push the person next to him onto the track and stop the trolley car, but it will kill that person. And the question is it okay for him to do that? He's not allowed to jump off and sacrifice himself. So this is the dilemma that participants are posed with. 85% of participants say it's not okay for him to do this, that you can't make the decision to sacrifice a human being. It's not up to you. But what we did was we added out groups from all these different quadrants on the track and on the overpass to get at the value of different people. We got acceptability ratings and MPFC activation from embedded in a social choice network. What you see is, now remember, the baseline is 80 to 90% of people say it's not okay to do this. But it totally changes when you put different groups on the bridge and on the tracks. So 69% of the people say it's okay to sacrifice, that is to push, low status, low competence groups. So a homeless person or an old person, it's okay to push them off the bridge to save 5 people. Who do you save? It's okay to do this sacrifice if you're saving high competence, high status groups. 77% say it's okay to do that. And the combination of sacrificing 1 poor person to save 5 in-group members, that is 5 middle-class people, 85%, 84% say it's okay to do that. So you completely reversed people's spontaneous judgment about whether it's okay to sacrifice 1 person to save 5. Mostly they say no, unless it's a homeless person you're pushing and it's middle-class people you're saving. And this differs from all the other combinations. Moreover, people are not doing this lightly. So if you look at brain scans of that particular comparison, what you get is activation of what is viewed as a difficult social choice network. But the MPFC is back again. So people are thinking about the minds and worth of the people that they're sacrificing and saving. All right. I'm going to close by offering some hope. The in-group for all of us is characterized by our interdependence with each other. And when people are interdependent, that is when we need each other, we care about each other's intentions because that predicts what people will do next. And the MPFC is an indicator that people is correlated with people thinking about each other's intentions. So we set up a situation where people were independent of each other as a control group. And we looked at what was activating in the MPFC when they were getting expected information about groups where they're independent from each other. The expected information activates the MPFC. But what if you really want to learn about a person? What if you want to get over your stereotypes and dehumanization of them? You need to look at the unexpected information, the counter-stereotypic information. And when people are interdependent with each other, that pattern completely reverses. And the MPFC indicates it. And we have decades of data showing that people pay attention, they think about it, and they reconsider their expectations about the other when they're interdependent. So what I want to argue is that one of the ways of making people rehumanize each other is by interdependence. because then they really consider each other as fully functioning human beings with expected and unexpected attributes. And these are my interdependent lab members. So I want to thank you and thank them for their work.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, that was very clear. And now could I ask Bérangère, Dr. Bérangère Thiriou, who is from Unité de Recherche Clinique Pierre Deniker, Centre Hospitalier Henri Laborit in Poitiers, who is headed by Professor Nemat Jafari, to give her contribution. Bérangère, bonjour.
Bonjour. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank Professor Mirdal and Fried and Berthoz for inviting me today. I will present the summary of the chapter that Professor Berthoz and I have written in the book entitled The Brains That Pull the Triggers. So the topic of my talk is the following question: are empathy and violence compatible? Sorry. Yeah. So at first sight, the answer is no. Empathy and violence are not compatible because they refer to two antagonist phenomena. But throughout history, there is a large number of examples that seems to contradict this postulate. So as described by Itzhak Fried, this is the case in syndrome E. Syndrome E, I won't go too deep into the detail, but it is has a semiological characteristic, that is to be a clinical paradox combining contradictory elements. So in addition to obsessive ideation, reduced affective reactivity, people with syndrome E commit repetitive acts of violence against specific and defenseless group, so out-group members. And they lead at the same time a normal social life, so with their in-group members, and also a normal family life. So they protect, then they love their friends and families, and they show normal empathic behaviors. Thus, the question of the compatibility of empathy and violence is much more complicated than originally thought. And I think the first question to address is to know what is compatibility. So compatibility refers to two elements: systems, ideas, beliefs, etc., that work well together or can exist together successfully. So we assume that empathy and violence are in fact compatible. They are compatible because empathy is not a continuous trait, but a dynamic mental state that can vary over time. So there are two resulting questions. How is the brain able to render the compatibility of empathy and violence possible? And the second question, what does this compatibility mean at the spatial and particularly at the temporal level of the brain functional organization? So in the next slides, I will show how empathy relates to morality, suggesting firstly that empathy and violence are not compatible. But then I will also show contradictory arguments suggesting that empathy and violence can be compatible. And for that, I will focus on 2 points. That is, first point, that empathy is not a continuous trait. And the second point, that empathy needs to be distinguished from sympathy. So empathy is the English translation from the German Einfühlung, which means to feel into, as introduced by the continental philosophy. So empathy refers to the capacity we have to feel and understand the lived experience of someone else and his associated mental state, while, and that it's important, adopting his visuospatial and psychological perspective, and while maintaining self-other distinction. So empathy relies upon bottom-up and top-down processes, and as such, it integrates several brain networks and activity within these networks. These networks are partly cooperating, partly competing. So that is activities in the mirror neuron systems, of course, in the theory of mind network. but also in the vestibular system, as we have shown with Alain Berthoz in our previous EEG work, and particularly in the TPG, so temporal parietal junction. Also, empathy integrates the central executive system and the DLPFC, the amygdala in the emotional system, but also two important resting state networks, that is the default mode network and the silence network. So empathy is an extremely complex phenomenon, and the complexity of its phenomenology is reflected in the complexity of its neurophysiology. And probably because of this complexity, empathy is a privileged way to mentally reach another person as a subject, is her alterity, that is to reach the other as other. It's also a very important way to feel and understand as objectively as possible the beliefs, the thoughts, the emotions, representations of someone else. But that it's possible if only at the same time one's ipseity is preserved. It means that in a real empathic relationships, there is no self-other confusion. There is no hypertrophy or hypotrophy of the self or of the other. There is a balanced relationship between two individuals, between two perspectives. And that's why a real empathic relationship leads to intersubjectivity. That is this balanced relationship between two perspectives and two individuals, but also to its correlate, that is objectivity. That is the fact that people can understand each other on the same object of thought, despite they can have different perspectives on the same object. So it's a reason why empathy is also considered a driving motivation of moral behavior and justice, as proposed by De City and Cowell, and that it has been shown that empathy favors pro-social altruist behaviors, inhibit antisocial behaviors, is a protective factor against violent and antisocial behaviors, and that training empathy reduces aggressive behaviors. But a meta-analysis on 5,400 subjects with 3,100 offenders shows that the negative correlation between low empathy and offending disappears when intelligence and social economic status have been controlled for. So it means that the alteration of empathy as a continuous trait in offenders, which was the hypothesis in this study, does not explain violence if empathy is tested between outbreaks. So it means that there is probably a complete breakdown of empathy during outbreaks, but that the empathic level of offenders between outbreaks is normal. So there are two observations. What is the appropriate time for evaluating empathy? And the second observation is that empathy is probably much more dynamic, a dynamic mental state. That's something that is continuous. Empathy can also generate parochial moral behavior. So as already said, individuals always favor in-group members, and they tend to more identify and cooperate with people from the same group. It leads to biased moral decision-making. And for example, there is abnormal activity in the orbitofrontal cortex when people from the same group are seeing their in-group members being armed by out-group members, which also elicit greater empathic responses. So this is an interesting hypothesis, but we think that it also partially conflates empathy and sympathy. Indeed, empathy means to feel into, when sympathy means to feel with. That is the same thing at the same time as someone else. So empathy relies upon self-other distinction, when sympathy, on the contrary, relies on self-other confusion. In empathy, there is a balanced interplay between one's own egocentric viewpoint and the viewpoint of the other. That is, people in empathy are mentally adopting the viewpoint of someone else in order to experience what the other are experiencing, but while keeping their own ipseity. In the contrary, in sympathy, people are keeping their own egocentric viewpoint, and they are self-attributing to themselves what the other are feeling and experiencing. And we have shown that this leads to a much greater activity of the mirror neuron system in sympathy, so in the red part here in the brain. And this greater activity of the mirror neuron system is not associated with activity in the vestibular system, particularly in the left TPG, which is known to enable the mental shift between perspective, that is between one's own egocentric perspective and the other perspective. So in contrary to empathy. So we propose that sympathy may lead to biased judgment, to biased moral judgment, in contrary to empathy, due to self-attribution and self-identification processes. And that will be particularly important within in-group members. The second point is that a real empathic relationship is the first necessary step for the development of morality and justice, because there is this preservation of one's ipseity and of the other's alterity, which is not the case in sympathy. The second point is that we have also shown in our previous work that empathy varies over time in healthy individuals, depending upon their psychological state, but also in psychiatric patients with schizophrenia, OCD, substance use disorder, depression. We also found the same variation of empathy, but depending upon their clinical state. So it means that empathy is much more dynamic, a dynamic functioning than a continuous trait. So based on these results and data, we have proposed with Alain Berthoz what we have called the threefold intersubjective clinical model of syndrome E. So at the semiological level, syndrome E is a clinical entity which combines normal empathic behaviors toward close friends and families. It means that lack of empathy in this syndrome is not constitutive of the syndrome. That lack of empathy in this syndrome is not a continuous mental state. Secondly, sympathetic relationship to the in-group members, which leads to self-identification and alteration of the sense of identity and group contagion. Third point, there is a complete but transitory breakdown of empathy, targeting specific outgroups and under specific socio-historical conditions. But what does it mean at the brain level, and particularly at the spatial level of the brain functional organization? As previously shown by Itzhak Fried, there is during outbreaks disorders in the prefrontal cortex, and also to the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the subcortical and the subcortical areas. So there is a normal activity of the DLPFC because people with syndrome E are still able to plan and to solve problems. But there is an hyperactivity of the orbital frontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, leading to obsessive ideation, repetitions of violent acts, and motivation for perpetrating atrocities. So this cognitive structure impacts the emotional processing because the prefrontal cortex is top-down modulating the activity of the amygdala. But we propose that there is also additional mechanisms, particularly abnormal activity in the vestibular system and the mirror neuron system. That is, during outbreaks, there is probably an hyperactivity of the right TPG, which normally sustain one's egocentric viewpoint. This would lead to the incapacity to disengage from one's egocentric reference frame, but also an hyperactivity of the left TPG, leading to the incapacity to shift perspective, and the hypoactivity of the mirror neuron system, leading to an incapacity to feel what the victims are feeling. So there is a cognitive affective fracture of the experience of the other as other, associated to an hypertrophy of the self. So there is normal brain functioning during normal empathic behaviors, but during sympathetic behaviors, so towards in-group members, we postulated that there is an hyperactivity of the mirror neuron system and limbic system, but hypoactivity of the orbital frontal cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. This would lead to self-identification, exaggerated adhesion of the emotional system to social beliefs and representations, and that without cognitive evaluation and criticisms. The last question, it will be my last slide. What does this mean?
You have to conclude.
Yeah. What does this mean? What does this simultaneity mean between abnormal and normal processes? Because it's not possible at a temporal level that there are normal and abnormal activity in the same weight networks. So we hypothesize that there is also additional dysfunctional brain mechanisms, but at rest. It's well documented, just 20 seconds, that the stability of large-scale brain networks at rest depends upon noise propagation, and that neural noise and brain state that are close to the stabilization contributes to the development of a given mental state and switch between states. So we propose that there is a too fast generation of noise propagation, leading to an increased facilitation of switch between brain states that are antagonists, impacting the DM and FPN interplay. So the disruption between the processing of ongoing internal thoughts, the ideation, the obsessions, and the external information that is a suffering of the other group members. In conclusion, syndrome E shows that empathy and violence may be compatible in the same individual. It's probably due to the nature of empathy, which is a dynamic mental state and not a continuous trait. Probably also due to the functional organization of the brain, in which the same networks may have normal or abnormal activity in different time windows under specific socio-historical conditions. But now it's time to really understand what does this compatibility mean, because there is no simultaneous activity. So it's now time to understand the interaction between the spatial and temporal aspect of syndrome E at the brain level, phenomenological level, psychological, sociological, and historical level. Because syndrome E is a perfect example of a biopsychosocial pathological phenomenon. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bérangère. I would like to ask Simon Luc if he can tell us what are the questions which have been received, and if he like to give us these questions and give the floor to the people who ask questions, and then we will see who are the speakers who want to eventually answer these questions.
Yes, hello everyone. We have no questions yet. So I remind everyone that you can ask a question, a written question, by clicking on Q and R at the bottom of your screen, or Q et R. So you can write down your question and we will answer them.
Okay, let's give 1 or 2 minutes for, is there any speaker who likes to ask another speaker for a question while we wait for the audience to ask questions?
Yeah, I think, one thing which I want to float over this round table, though it looks like a linear table here, on the Zoom.
The screen
is really the question. What Susan was actually talking about, this issue of theory of mind, and I thought it was quite intriguing that these areas, with respect to this lowest of the groups, right? That in a sense, what is happening, I think that when we essentially see people as objects, it really is reflected in various brain areas. In our perceptual area, when we look at the face, of a victim, if we are a perpetrator, then really those face areas are probably not activated, as was seen in that fMRI study. And what Susan showed, that in fact that area of theory of mind is not activating, meaning we don't attribute, when we are a perpetrator, we don't attribute to the victims any mind, really. They are completely objects. So it's really both on the perceptual level and on the level of theory of mind that we have this this whole sort of in our functional brain. So I wonder, what my other colleagues will have to say about it.
And so I agree very much, and I think it also relates to what Bérangère was talking about, in that as a social psychologist, I'm more interested in the situations people are in and how those can change their empathy. So in essence, when you're thinking about somebody else's mind, you're empathizing with them. And in the case of the failure of the activation of the theory of mind interested medial prefrontal cortex. So if you tell people that when they're looking at the homeless people's pictures, if you say you're working in a soup kitchen and you have to decide what he'll eat for lunch, would he like broccoli? Something as trivial as that brings back online the social cognition theory of mind related areas. And so, you can do something as elaborate as making people interdependent and putting them on the same team together, but that's not practical on a large scale. And I think to just get people to think about somebody else's preferences, as trivial as what they would eat for lunch, can engage them more deeply in other people as humans.
Okay.
Okay, I was really interested at the study that shows difference of perception of the soldier and the civilian for video gamers. Do we have something similar with hunters? I mean, the difference between game and humans?
Well, again, this would be an interesting question. I guess, the question is, how does the hunter views the hunted, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Probably, yeah, exactly, yeah. That's probably similar.
So we've applied our framework to animals, and people eat animals in the pity quadrant.
Okay.
So sheep and cows, they're seen as kind of stupid, but well-meaning. We don't tend to eat predators who are, highly competent, but not threatening. We don't tend to eat vermin.
Okay. Thanks.
Patrick?
Yeah, thanks very much. A very interesting set of talks. All three talks absolutely fascinating and really exciting. And I just have a couple of thoughts which occur to me as sort of brainstorming, I suppose. So several speakers talked about the idea that one can treat a person as an object. And I think we're particularly interested here in the unfortunate cases where one person treats another as an object with malicious intent or with bad intent. And I just wondered whether we can think about contrasting that with the case where one treats another person as an object, but with good intent. So, for example, there are some fantastic people at the moment who are sticking needles into millions of other people. I was lucky enough to benefit from this, and I really didn't have time to even see the person who came at me with a needle, shoved it into my arm, and potentially saved my life. So there's a lot of good intent there, but I think for the nice, I can't remember whether it was a woman or a man who vaccinated me, I don't think they treated me as anything more than an object. So I just wonder whether that's a topic which could be picked up. And then I have one other sort of thought, which is really related to the evolution of society. And it picks up on the comment you made, Susan, about how much we dislike the people who are not settled, the people who are of no fixed abode, the homeless, the immigrants. So I think there's some room for some very interesting cross-cultural comparisons to see whether equal things apply in less settled societies, such as nomadic societies. And it's also interesting to think about how long we have ourselves been settled as a species. It's not that long in terms of evolutionary time. So presumably, this is all just cultural learning, that we've learned something about property, which is causing us to have violent and unpleasant interactions to other agents. I find that really scary. Thank you.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about what it is about people without an address that makes them outside of consideration as human and not part of society. And I think part of it is that if they were competent, they would own things. You know, given that we equate status and owning things on the one hand with competence on the other. And so they're disrespected in that way. But then also they're not trustworthy, because if they do something bad, you can't find them. And they're not invested in the community. So I think nomadic peoples are particularly, prone to be dehumanized in that way. To your other point about the medical interventions, there's been some work done that shows that when people are actually in the process of treating somebody, like doing surgery, they have to dehumanize them and turn them into a piece of meat. So it's a good thing we're anesthetized when they do that.
Oh, but they actually also awake surgeries which are done, right? But I can tell you definitely as a surgeon that the whole process of surgery is really geared toward, creating an object, really. You cannot drape the person, right? The person is now under drapes. It's not really any human object, but it's just an object now. And I think you do have to create a mini fracture in order to be able to really concentrate, on the meticulous steps. So it's not really a full-fledged cognitive fracture, but I think it is a well-planned mini fracture that you are creating, as a surgeon.
And very carefully regulated. So well planned and well
Very
regulated.
carefully. Yeah.
Thank you. Simon, did you get anything from our audience?
Yes, we now do have several questions. So the first one was from Valérie Ayert, who asks, is in particular directed to you, Alain, and Bérangère. How do you relate the neural basis of your definition of empathy to moral values, such as justice?
Bérangère, you have the floor. You mentioned, Bérangère mentioned the work by Jean de Setti, who has actually concentrated his work recently. Jean de Setti is now in America, is in Chicago, and he has mainly concentrated his work on this aspect of morality. Bérangère, can you answer the question briefly?
Briefly.
Yes.
I will try to, yes. I would say that the neural basis of empathy and how empathy is functioning is the condition of possibility of moral and values and justice. So all the different integration of activity leads then to a more prefrontal and frontal activity associated with justice. So there are the condition. They are conditioning the activity in the prefrontal cortex during moral and justice situations, if I understood correctly the question.
So we could refer the Valérie Ayert, who is an historian that we know, and she has been actually a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies, working on La Dame Justice. So thank you, Valérie, for your question. Any other questions, Simon?
Yes, so a question from Don Weening, who says thank you to the presenters, and has a question on causality. Is syndrome E a description, or a causal mechanism? And related to that, violence is bodily action. So how can we conceptualize the relationship between brain processes and bodily processes?
Itzhak, you can at the same time answer the question concerning morality, right? If you have something, I'm sure you have something to say about the relation.
Well, just with respect to the issue of causality, of course, we can only talk about correlation, at this point in terms of the hypothesis. But maybe one aspect which is kind of interesting and came out in Dr. Robbins' talk, Trevor Robbins, the issue that you can essentially elicit such states, with certain pharmacological intervention, or there are certainly some drugs, which may instigate a situation which is similar to that in syndrome E, meaning that you got an hyper-arousal and a very efficient hyperactive situation, where, for instance, a terrorist would be able to really kill, hundreds of people, but at the same time, you have this diminished affective reactivity. So that's actually create, quite an efficient, killer situation. So that may indicate that you can actually instigate, or you can cause, those states in the brain which are more conducive to this type of syndrome.
Thank you. Simon, une autre question ou pas?
Yes, there are others. And there was also the part about the link between the mind and the body in the syndrome E theory, and how you conceptualize the relationship between brain processes and bodily processes.
Yeah, so I mean, are we going to try and solve the mind-body problem here, or are we pushed into a dualist
No, we are not.
Sure or not? That's the question.
It's not in the program of the round table.
Yeah, I think, obviously there is always, and one of the criticism is always that we are trying, to be reductionist in our approaches. But, I think at this point, most of our arguments are really correlative, and we're not really, able to address, causal inferences, except for, the thing which I just mentioned about pharmacokinetics.
Okay, Simon, another one?
There are two more questions. One, I guess, is more for Susan. Why do we usually tend to search or to define people based on their faces? We often hear people say, this person did not look mean.
Well, the two dimensions that I've mentioned, warmth of intent and competence to enact it, have been shown in facial dimensions too. So Alex Todorov's work, for example, shows that trustworthiness is inferred from facial structure and also dominant. So dominance, not surprisingly, more masculine faces are seen as more dominant and higher status, and more feminine faces are seen as less dominant and lower status. And so, yeah, and then there's a trustworthiness dimension too, which is the warmth one. So, it's not that there's necessarily any truth in it, but people do have expectations about people based on their faces. When you're interacting with somebody or even seeing them from a little bit of a distance, the face is one of the first cues that you can pick up. I mean, apart from if they're brandishing a weapon or something. So I don't know why we use faces, except that they're the center of interaction.
Thank you very much. You have a last question, I think.
Yes, from Daniel Andler, who asked, well, he remarks that there are far fewer female than male mass murderers. And he wonders if that is the result of a lack of opportunity, or if there is a common factor that would be leading to less participation in situations favoring mass murder and to lesser propensity to mass murder in women.
So thank you, Daniel. Daniel is both mathematician and philosopher. He is an academician, and thank you. Who is going to answer this question? Itzhak.
Well, I think, when I sort of pointed out this as a clinical syndrome, I did put risk factors as part of it. And obviously, based on experience of what we have seen and observed, there is definitely male gender is a risk factor based on history. And, so I really want to understand, is the question, are the male-female differences, or what is the question really?
Can we ask Daniel, what is the question?
I would nominate testosterone as an important variable.
You're probably right.
Okay, Okay, I think it may be, if we have no more questions, even from the speakers, from one speaker to another speaker, as far as, okay, let me just make a very small comment, which is not a criticism, but a comment. We heard two very different presentations concerning the brain. On one hand, Susan, who picked up very specific areas like middle cortex, as if something crucial was happening there. And Bérangère, who, in the contrary, gave us what may have seen a complex set of complex networks. And I think it should be clear to the audience, unless some speaker disagrees with me, that none of us think that any of these things happened in only one area in the brain, but that the brain is always working in networks, either cooperating or competing. Do we agree with that?
Yes, and I want to say that, you know, I was working on these things a while ago at the beginning of the social neuroscience revolution, and people were much more oriented at that time toward specific brain areas rather than networks. And I recognize that it's a sort of naive analysis.
Thank you. So we are ready now, if you are ready to hear from Sadi Lalou, who is both professor at the London School of Economics and the president of the Paris Institute for Advanced Studies. He's a sociologist, but he has many multidisciplinary arrows in his casket. Sadi, perfect.
Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk also not just about what's in the brain, which is not really my specialism, but also about what's outside of it and brings what we have observed, and so about framing and context. So we're wondering about these mass killers because they have no inhibition to kill, no shame, no guilt, no regret, but pride, perhaps even excitement. How did they get there? And the question is, how can we rehabilitate them? I may be a bit pessimistic because I'm a psychologist, but the question of how do they get there also asks us, I mean, are they so strange? There are other situations pretty similar. If you look at hunters who enjoy mass killing of animals, or we see here on the right, the victory marks on this bomber of how many people have been killed or by these bombers, or how many planes have been downed, and they express pride. So hunting and war are other examples where we seem to see similar patterns. And indeed, aggression and violence are very usual behaviors in animals. And I think it's quite important to distinguish two types. One which is intraspecific, like hunting, another which is intraspecific violence. And these are connected with very different patterns. There are many causes for aggression and violence and killing. It could be predation, defense, stress, fear. And colleagues have noted another series, rivalry, envy, status, hatred, and also appropriation or fear can be good reasons for that. And in humans, intraspecific violence doesn't seem to be problematic. We call this hunting or eradication, while in fact it is very regulated to be violent against conspecifics, right? We have regulations for that, but it's okay to kill vermin. It's not okay to kill people. And we have similarly analogous behaviors, of which some are authorized and even recommended, like war or executions, and some which are completely forbidden, like terrorism or assassination. And there's a big difference between killing Louis the 16th on the bottom left and assassination of President Kennedy on the bottom right. And so it's a matter of values, of who is the target and what is the process, pretty much. And if you look at things that have already been hinted at by our colleagues, depending on target status, it is okay or not okay to kill. The first main distinction is between human and non-human, and basically it's okay to kill non-human, and it's really okay to kill vermin, right? In terms of human, it really depends whether they're in your in-group, and then it's not okay to be violent, it's forbidden. If it's the out-group, it's a bit different. There's a difference between the adversaries, where it's not so okay to kill them, but you can be bad to them, and the enemy, where it's okay to kill. I mean, that's the difference between a soldier and a civilian from the out-group, for example, as has been shown by my colleagues. And so the most important, probably, feature of our problem here is what Jacques Semelin described very well in what happens in mass killings, is the assimilation of targets to non-humans, which is the start of the whole thing, the whole process. And this actually brings them into the interspecific mode, where the kill is guilt-free, basically. I mean, that's okay to kill them if they're non-human, right? But this is not so simple, and some killers may still be aware that these are humans, and we also have, you know, to consider the fact that they are aware they're killing conspecifics. And there are a series of intraspecific violence safeguards. First, it's not that easy to kill somebody with bare hands. I mean, the humans are pretty resistant, and if you beat someone, it's hard to beat someone to death with your bare hands. The other thing is that we all have a natural inhibition to kill. I mean, people don't like to kill conspecifics. They even before, I mean, acculturation and training, there seems to be an inhibition to kill. That's just been well described by ethologists, seems to be universal. Then we have institutional, you know, safeguards, law, religion, ideology. Most cultures severely repress intraspecific violence, and especially killing some fellow man is an internalized, you know, ban in most cultures. And finally, there's the rational approach to it, which means that people might be hesitant to kill somebody else because of fear of damage or retaliation, because the defendant might actually defend herself or himself. So in most societies, killers are abnormal, they're severely punished. Normal individuals have strong natural aversion and cultural aversion to kill fellow humans. Nevertheless, this, as I said, is prohibition towards other humans, so intraspecific, and for people of the in-group. And there are bypass techniques, right? Well known. For example, weapons enable killing people easier than bare hands. If you do not have sensory or mental, I mean, closeness to the victim, it's easier to kill. It's easier to kill by pressing a button or a trigger than to kill someone with bare hands. Institutional, you know, clearance or incentives can actually be something that waives all the moral problems, and finally, the rational fear of retaliation can be, you know, outpowered by a power balance or protection of the killers, which is what we actually see in most mass killings. So all these things, plus the fact that, as we know very well, most humans, I mean, humans are not teddy bears, right? Most of them will easily commit intraspecific violence if they're put in specific conditions, and the context is pretty important. We have, again, cited the seminal works of Stanley Milgram in '61, and we know that about 2/3 of normal subjects, I mean, can actually go to deliver lethal electric shock to what they believe is a real person in the next room, and many of them do that even if they have to touch the person as they do it. And we know by experience that during war, a lot of normal persons end up as killers without that so many difficulties. Nevertheless, again, it seems that the first time you kill is more difficult. And it's not just the first time you kill, it's the first time you do something that is deviant behavior. Well, Howard Becker noted that outsiders feel strong inhibition to perform the deviant behavior the first time. and they feel what he calls a strong impulse to law abiding, right? And what happens is that in deviant groups, there have been a series of techniques of neutralization to go beyond this strong impulse to a law abiding or respect the social norm, like denial of responsibility, denial of injury, denial of the victim, condemnation of the condemners, appeal to higher loyalties, for example. Then we have seen techniques routinely employed by various governments or groups of brainwashing, which means you train the novice subjects by putting them in a group with people who are more advanced in the ideology. The work of Edgar Schein on this is really interesting. You can also have use the scapegoat mechanism, where you target frustration and into hatred to a specific groups. I mean, it's very well known that the Jews, for example, have been the targets, but it's been a lot of minorities have often been the targets of this, targeted hatred and frustration. And then what seems to happen, and I have no idea of how it works in the brain, but my observation is that there seems to be a sort of combat mode where people get into the spirit of being in battle, and so that's when the outgroup is the enemy, and there's a mixture of excitement, group loyalty, obedience, groupthink, and also endurance, and seems to be something quite common in war times, but not just in wartime, with big catastrophes or stuff like that. So there are a series of techniques that are used to sort of decondition the humans to let the violence operate. But if you talk about mass killing, this is not just about individual, reconditioning or brainwash or incitation. If you look at it, these things are organized. First, there needs to be a mass ideological framing. You have the use of media, you have creation of content, you have training of speakers and leaders, institution, you use language rules to make these things acceptable in the local culture. I'm showing on the bottom left a Nazi, a propaganda poster. And you also have organization and mass equipment and logistics, right? Weaponry, training, identification, control to make people who oppose comply, camps, transportation, organization, mass graves, and a lot of things. It's a whole business. It's a large organization. And this is when we can see starting what is going to become mass killing. This is not happening like just one isolated, a person. This is usually organized and planned. And so this creation of installation, that is systems, multi-layer system that channel a specific set of people into doing these mass killings, is something that is distributed over 3 layers. First, the material affordances, like the logistics, the weapons, the killing grounds, the camps, and also the killing procedures for scaling that up, okay? Then the second layer, which we were most interested in the first part of this conference, how to gradually use propaganda to move the target status from fellow to outgroup to vermin, using values arguments, because it's values, as Susan has shown very well, that distinguishes in-groups and out-groups, okay? So these are the arguments based on values. Then you can leverage frustration to produce and target the collective hatred. Community building is essential to keep group pressure. And then you have these techniques of neutralization I talked about. And finally, you need social regulation. That's a larger layer of the organizers who create the ideology, the rules, the law, the affiliation, perhaps a whole philosophy and authority system, and then the social division of labor and the organization of these mass killings. And so this whole layered structure is quite resilient, and so it enables novices to learn by doing, right? By observing how the others, and under group pressure, they do it, and then once the first kill is done, embodied competencies are acquired, and external scaffolding can be reduced because people become autonomous. They know how to do it on their own incentive, and this is perhaps the moment something has changed in their brain. to sum up, and this is my last slide, if you want to do efficient prevention and containment of the problem of mass killing, you must consider all the aspects of its construction beyond the individual brain. I mean, humans are easily to be conditioned, and they potentially can be violent, right? Especially against other species, right? But the construction of mass killings is something that can be countered if you address constantly with vigilance the terrain, you know, people who can become killers, those who are frustrated, the process of group affiliation that will be necessary for this kind of conditioning. Also look at the mechanisms of framing and conditioning the individuals. And it's quite easy to see when the propaganda starts on a large level that something bad might happen if you don't stop it, right? And also be aware when you start seeing these engagement and neutralization techniques in groups. I mean, this is the beginning of some problem, the training in a way to do this. And also the institutional framework planning and organizing, because usually this is planned at large level, otherwise it never gets to massive scale. And this is also visible by the logistics that gets installed gradually. And after 14 minutes, I'm stopping, Alain, so you don't have to ring. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Very nice. Thank you, Sadi. And now we are ready to hear Patrick Haggard from University College London, Volition, Agency, Violence. Patrick.
Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to begin by thanking the IEA in its full range, and thanking ITSAC in particular for many links into this project over the years. I think I first went to a Syndrome E conference in 2016 or so, and I've spoken to ITSAC, Gretty, Alain, many others about it over the years, and always found the conversations very challenging, but the topic is important, and it's been a pleasure to be associated with the intellectual work. I'd like to thank this Paris-Saclay share, which allowed me to continue thinking about these things a little bit when I was at IEA last year. So I'm an experimental cognitive psychologist, and I've been studying human action. So how can the study of human action tell us about violence? I'm going to begin with some fairly textual points. So we can assume that people normally have volitional control over their actions. That means that people decide for themselves what to do. And this includes many of their violent actions. I'll come on to why I say many later on. So violent behavior is often a personal choice, right? Just like most of the other things that I may do may be a personal choice. Now, people's action choices depend strongly on sociocultural instruction and reinforcement learning. So what people choose to do depends on many factors, but one of the factors is whether you've been told that it's a good thing to do, whether you've been told that it's a right thing to do, whether you've been punished for it, choosing that in the past, or whether you've been rewarded for choosing that in the past. So it follows that social environments can either discourage violence or favor it. And I think what I'm going to be telling you about today is just one way in which this social influence on action can work. Now, one big question that we always have in psychology is, how do you measure it? How do you measure the functions of the mind? And when people make volitional actions, when people decide for themselves what to do and then do it, then their actions are associated with a sense of agency over their actions. So Wittgenstein famously asked, what is the difference between the fact that my arm goes up and the fact that I raise my arm? Now, Wittgenstein thought that was a stupid question. I think it's quite a good question. And I think the answer is, I have a sense of agency when I lift my arm, but if you come running up to me and you lift my arm, then I don't have a sense of agency. So the sense of agency gives us this sort of subjective correlate of our own will and voluntary control of our actions. And it's also essential for having the experience of being responsible. So if you're responsible for something happening, then you will feel a sense of agency over that thing, and you will have it will be a product of your voluntary control system. And a few years ago, after thinking about the sense of agency and the whole sort of process of volition for a long time, we decided that maybe we can actually measure it. And I just want to very briefly present you with a sort of an attempt to scientifically measure the sense of agency, which is based on a chronometric effect in the lab called intentional binding. So what happens is the participant is invited to press a button. So that's the action, you press a button, and 250 milliseconds later, the button press causes a beep. So the beep is the effect or the outcome of the action. And we use a set of techniques that I won't go into in detail called mental chronometry, where you ask people when they think things happen. And in the history of psychology, asking people when they think things happen is a very good way to find out how those things are represented in the mind. So if you just have an action by itself, it turns out that people don't perceive it to happen when it actually happens. There's a bit of an error in when you think actions happen. And if you just have a beep by itself, there's a bit of an error in when you think beeps happen. So these dashed lines here indicate the subjective time at which people think an action happens and the subjective time at which people think a beep happens. And what we've done in these experiments is now to put the action and the beep together and to ask people, when do you think the action happens, given that it's followed by a beep, or when do you think the beep happens, given that you caused it by your own action? And you get these shifts, which I've shown here in orange, such that actions that cause beeps are perceived to happen later than actions that don't cause beeps. And beeps are perceived to happen much earlier if you've caused them through your own action than if they just happen by themselves. So these numbers here are the change in the perceived time of an event in milliseconds. So people perceive the action and the beep as happening closer together than they really are when it's a voluntary action. And in this lower condition, we've got involuntary movements, which we actually produce by stimulating the brain with magnetic stimulation, which produces little sort of twitches, a little bit like you might use to press a button. And you don't get this binding effect. So there's something about the temporal association between I pressed the button and it produced the beep, which causes these things to be perceived as close together. And you don't get that if the same physical events occur without my volition. I don't feel the sense of agency over the beep. I don't feel responsible for the beep. So now we've got a sort of implicit low-level measurement of how much people feel responsible for beeps. A little bit boring, but nevertheless, at least a way to measure sense of agency, which is relevant to responsibility. Now, how can this be relevant to syndrome E? What has this got to do with violence? Well, here you're pressing a button and you're producing a beep, but of course, quite often you'll make an action which, rather than producing a beep, will cause some horrendous outcome. You'll hurt somebody, you might kill somebody. So what about violent actions that produce nasty outcomes? So when thinking about syndrome E recently, it's always quite useful to think, what is syndrome E not? And I want to talk a little bit about something which contrasts rather clearly with syndrome E, which is the phenomenon of loss of control. So loss of control is a legal phrase. It's a phrase in English law, and other legal systems have similar ideas. And it's the acknowledgement that violent actions triggered in extreme fear or anger may be involuntary. So there are some cases where the law might not actually hold you responsible for the outcomes of your action, or at least it will hold you less responsible. So these are classically classic situations for this are depicted here. So suppose some horrible, aggressive person approaches me, and I am, of course, terrified. So I'm in a state of fear. And in the state of fear, there are three very low-level responses which seem to happen in many species: fight, flight, and freeze. Now, if I end up choosing the fight option, then this is thought to come from a low-level circuit, very possibly based on the amygdala. And there's a sense in which my fight response is not now voluntary. I fight back in an involuntary way. So if I happen to injure the aggressor, am I really responsible? And according to the loss of control defense, maybe you're less responsible. I'm not going to talk about anger today. The key thing to think about here is that we're thinking about the person who is about victims fighting back. We're not thinking about aggressive perpetrators. And syndrome E is not this, right? So syndrome E is much more about what the aggressor does rather than about the victim who might make an involuntary movement to fight, an involuntary reactive aggression to fight back. So syndrome E is not about the loss of control. In fact, in syndrome E, it looks as though there's actually too much control or a lot of control. So let's look now at social situations where volitional actions and free choices are strongly guided. And this fits very nicely with what Sadi was just saying. So there are some social environments where we don't want people doing whatever they want. We really don't want people to just sort of make up their mind and have a go and feel free. So under military command, it's imperative that soldiers obey orders. And it's interesting to note that under military command, some forms of violence are actually encouraged, and we expect the soldiers to obey the orders. But there are other sort of perhaps less scary cases like air traffic control. So in air traffic control, you have to follow the rules. You don't want people saying, oh, I didn't feel like changing the runway for that plane. You really have to constrain free choice. So in these kind of constrained environments, who is actually responsible for, you know, the press of the button which pulls the trigger or which diverts the plane from one runway to another? Is it the person who gives the orders, or is it the person who follows them? Is it the rule makers, or is it the rule takers? So we've already heard the Milgram experiment, and the focus on the Milgram experiment has been the claim, the original claim from Milgram that most people obey orders. I'm not going to re-describe the experiment here. There are lots of problems with this experiment. I'm really, really unhappy about the Milgram experiment. And we started looking at the sense of responsibility under orders with a rather different question. So the question that I'm going to talk about is, do people feel a sense of agency over bad outcomes when they are told what to do, when they're given coercive instructions? And the reason this is important is perhaps people obey orders. This is what Milgram drew attention to. Perhaps people obey orders because coercive instruction alters their free choice and causes a low sense of agency. Maybe the reason why Milgram was apparently able to get people to obey orders so much is because when people obeyed his orders, they didn't feel responsible for what they were actually obviously doing. That is the line of thought. So we have been studying coercion and sense of agency, and we've got an experimental design which I think in some ways improves on Milgram's experimental designs. I don't think it's perfect, but it avoids some of the things I don't like about his. So here is the experimenter, and the experimenter tests a pair of volunteer participants, healthy volunteer participants. One of them is the agent who will press a button, and one of them is the quote victim unquote who will receive a moderately painful electric shock. And the victim actually, the quote victim does actually receive a moderately painful electric shock through a medically approved pain stimulator. And the agent knows that. The agent knows that this is real pain because the agent has previously experienced that pain themselves. So we use the victim word in quotes because these are not actually victims. These are people who are volunteer participants in a sort of Helsinki experiment. The participants work in pairs. So in the second half of the experiment, the roles of agent and quote victim are reversed. So the method is at least reciprocal. It's not very pleasant, but at least it's not, at least it's, as it were, balanced. And in one condition, the experimenter gives a coercive instruction to the agent about which button to press, which means that the agent presses either one button which gives the victim a shock, or another button which does not give the victim a shock. And whichever button is pressed, there's always a beep which occurs sometime after the agent presses the button. So there's always a beep, and sometimes it's accompanied by a shock or not. In the other condition, the agent freely chooses which button to press and thus whether she gives a shock to the quote victim or not, and the experimenter remains in the room but doesn't play any role. So here the point is that you freely choose whether you want to give the other person a shock or not. Now, why would you ever possibly do that? Well, remember that the roles previously were reversed. So it may be that this person shocked you and you want to shock her back. All of the participants in these experiments are female, and we can go into the reasons for that later, but we didn't want to include any gender asymmetries in these designs for obvious reasons. So what I'm showing here is the perceived time that the agent thinks elapses between pressing the button and hearing the beep, which accompanies the shock or non-shock that the victim experiences. And on the x-axis, I'm showing the actual interval between pressing the button and hearing the beep. So at random, the beep happens 200, 500, or 800 milliseconds after the agent presses the button, and the agent simply reports how long they think that interval was. And what you can see is that in the free choice condition, agents reliably report the interval between the action and the beep as shorter than in the coercive condition, where the experimenter has told them exactly which button they're going to press and whether they're going to be giving a shock to the other person or not. So the gap between these lines corresponds to a reduction in the perceived interval between pressing the button and getting the outcome, which we interpret as a reduction in the sense of agency. So the agents feel a reduced sense of agency when they've been given a coercive instruction by the experimenter. And remember that we're not using words like coercion or anything like that in this experiment. It's a completely implicit measure. All you're asked to say is, how long is the time delay? Now, an interesting feature of this this is just some brain data, which shows that this is the brain's response to the tone. And in the dark line, you can see that the brain response to the tone is actually less in the coercive condition than in the free choice condition. So the brain somehow doesn't register the outcome so much. Interestingly, you get this effect both in the trials where you press the button that produces a shock, and also when you press the button which produces no shock. So there's no difference according to what the outcome is. It's not an effect of bad outcomes, it's an effect of choice context. So when we're coerced, we don't have the sense of our relation to the outcome that we have when we freely choose. That's the point here. So coercion really reduces the sense of agencies. Now, I just want to go through some text implications of this. Now, of course, it's well known that people often claim reduced responsibility when they're only obeying orders. That's sometimes called the Nuremberg Defense. And there are lots and lots of concerns with this defense. This claim of reduced responsibility when obeying orders is highly problematic. It's always viewed with suspicion, and absolutely rightly so, because of course it's easy to say that, and there's a secondary gain from making that claim. The interesting and I think rather sort of scary finding from our experiment is that people who are obeying orders may not just claim reduced responsibility, but may actually experience less responsibility to the extent that they show reduction in this measure of intentional binding, which we think is at least a proxy for the sense of agency. So that's a concern because it means that maybe things feel different when you're told to do something bad. An altered sense of agency under coercion might explain why some people sometimes obey bad orders. So if I am given a coercive instruction to do something bad and I do it, and I feel less linkage to the outcome, less sense of agency over the outcome, then that may be one of the reasons why I can actually cope with doing such a bad action. We haven't had time to talk about this, but in another experiment with Emily Kaspar, we looked at what does it feel like for the experimenter? What's the subjective experience of agency for the person who gives the orders? And it turns out the person who gives the orders also experiences reduced responsibility. So it's not the case that responsibility is passed up the chain from the agent to the commander. It just seems to disappear. Nobody seems to feel this intentional binding over the outcome. And I think this is obviously, for me, really worrying because it means that coercion undermines responsibility. It is capable of reducing the way we feel about what we are actually doing. There is no doubt that in these experiments, people are actually pressing the button, which is actually causing a painful shock. There's no deception. There's no way that you could not understand what you're doing. And I think what this means is that societies need to very carefully manage the social transfer of the sense of agency and responsibility. And there needs to be a clear way of controlling the potential corrosive power of coercion to take away this important feature of our cognition, that we know what we're doing, we potentially know what the outcomes of our actions are, and we can potentially have a sense of agency and thus have a society based on responsibility. So coercion threatens that, and to that extent, it needs to be very, very carefully managed in social structures. The state monopoly of coercion is perhaps a conventional political doctrine which can protect us from the kinds of cognitive phenomena that we've discovered in these experiments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for this extremely clear talk. Thank you so much. And now we are ready to listen to Leor Zmigrod, who is from University of Cambridge and also a fellow of the Paris Institute for Advanced Studies. And she will speak about violence, values, and ideology. L'idéologie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers as well for inviting me to speak amongst such a wonderful set of panelists. So I'll be talking today about a set of empirical work, experiments that I've done on the topics of violence and ideology and how we can use the cognitive sciences and neuroscience in order to unpack these processes. And it's actually nice that Patrick just ended.
Sorry, Leor.
Yes.
Could you turn on your video so we can see you at the same time? I don't know if it's on.
Moi, je la vois très bien.
Okay, so sorry, it is on. Good.
No problem. So Patrick just spoke of coercion, and one of the kind of the best ways that we've had to think about ideologies and how they promote violence has been by thinking about the ways in which they coerce individuals. And naturally, one of the most prominent political philosophers to think about this was Hannah Arendt, who really thought about how ideologies, totalitarian ideologies specifically, coerce not just our behavior, but our minds as well. And she wrote that what totalitarian ideologies aim at is not the transformation of the outside world, but the transformation of human nature itself. And I think that that's a really interesting and relevant metaphor for just thinking about the brains that pull the trigger in general, and for thinking about all the ways in which ideologies really become internalized by the mind. And so I'll be talking about some empirical work that hopefully taps at this question. But before looking widely at how violence is promoted and encouraged, it's good to think about what ideologies are more generally and just to take a step back. And to some degree, we can think about ideologies as these really compelling stories, as these narratives that tell us about what the world is, what the world ought to be. And so in many ways, they describe human action and the conditions in which humans live in the natural world, and they prescribe it as well. So they prescribe how we ought to think, how we ought to act, and how we ought to interact with others, as many of the speakers have been talking about. And because there are those prescriptions, that creates always a relational element to ideologies. There are always going to be in-groups and out-groups. And that is starting to be the difference between simply values and ideologies. It's when ideologies occur or take place psychologically when we are also really viewing people in terms of their in-group association to us or out-group. And when we begin to demonize, show hostility and prejudice towards out-groups, that is when ideologies can start fomenting into something that can turn violent. Now, ideologies exist in all these different forms, the political and the religious and the nationalistic, in all these different social realms. And that's a really important part of how we think about it, because often there's this tendency to really look at the content of the ideology, its missions, the beliefs that it proposes or rejects. But really, and I think many of the speakers today have been thinking about it in that way, about the structure of ideologies. How does it, regardless of its content, shape people's minds and reciprocally how minds give rise to these kinds of ideologies. Now, these ideologies play a really critical role in people's lives, in every person's life. And I think that's an important question that maybe we'll get back to. A lot of the discussions around syndrome E look at it in its very extreme manifestation, but perhaps it's also useful to really think about it in its continua, in all the ways in which there are precursors and more normative forms of ideologies that still are reminiscent enough of the kind of violent forms that ideologies sometimes take. So we know that ideologies in terms of religion, in terms of politics, they play a very active role in people's lives. And as we've been talking about in conflict, so many people are harmed by violence in the name of ideological causes and commit violence in the name of ideological causes. So when we're starting to unpack the psychological origins of ideological thinking, it's important to think about what are causal mechanisms that we're proposing. So where do the causal arrows point towards? And one way to think about it is the role of situations. And we just heard a little bit about that, about how potentially ideological doctrines are thought to coerce people through these kind of powerful situations that really almost everybody is susceptible to, and is susceptible to then becoming very obedient to authority, very conformist, and all those precursors that allow violence to emerge. So situations is kind of the situational narrative of ideology is one important way to think about it. Another way that's emerged over the last 50, 60 years is really thinking about motivations. So how do particular motivations that all humans have, motivations to belong, motivations to achieve meaning and coherence about the world, motivations to seek significance, to feel that one's life is meaningful, how do all of those motivations make us gravitate towards ideologies, get us to see them as very, very attractive and very appealing? And so looking at situations, looking at motivations is incredibly important. And what I think the past, probably mostly 5 years, have really looked at in political psychology and political neuroscience is the relationship between cognition more broadly and ideologies as a bidirectional relationship, as looking at how certain cognitive traits of the mind might induce people to search for ideologies or commit to ideologies that kind of reflect those cognitive needs or those cognitive tendencies. And on the other side, important to think about how immersion in particular ideological situations can shape cognition and shape the brain in return. And I think all of this is really relevant to how we think about syndrome E. Now, I'll give a very broad overview of the research that I've done rather than the particulars, but all of these can be found and read about elsewhere for anybody who's interested. So the question that I've really been thinking about is, why do some individuals get swept up in ideologically motivated violence while others do not? So I think earlier Professor Itzhak mentioned how about 10 to 20% of people in all those classic social psychological tasks don't obey the authority, don't actually go on to commit violence. Sometimes we think of those as weird, but I think it's really important to look at those as a continuum and think about how do those people relate to the people who are actually very quickly drawn to ideologies and to engaging in violence. So in the same way that there are the people who resist, there are also some people who are more prone than other people. So interesting to think about those individual differences. And in the experiments I've conducted, basically using thousands of participants online, what we've looked at is the relationship between people's ideologies, their kind of like tendencies towards violence, and their cognition. So when we measure individuals, and these are in normative samples in the US, in the UK, in France, in Germany, everywhere, we're looking at how much people are reporting that they're willing to endorse violence to protect their group, and even how willing they are to die for their group, how willing they are to sacrifice their life for the group. And those are all of those kinds of precursors to really radical action that we can measure in individuals that vary on these kinds of metrics. And on the other side of it, we have been giving them these cognitive tasks from the kind of cognitive psychology literature that tap at various psychological tendencies. So as you can see, for those of you who are familiar with psychology and for those of you who are not, these tasks very much are perceptual. So they require people to respond to changing rewards. So they're learning certain rules, and then suddenly those rules change. And we want to see how adaptable people are. So that's, for instance, a measure of cognitive flexibility. We also look at how they make decisions in these kinds of perceptual environments. So very similar to the ones that Patrick has been talking about. When we give people these perceptual stimuli, how do they learn from them? How do they respond to them? How do they form decisions? And we also give them these slightly more higher level, complex or strategic cognitive tasks that require them to plan, to mentally simulate intricate steps. And so basically, we give these participants a battery of all sorts of tasks that tap at individual differences in cognitive functioning. And so I'll broadly summarize the kinds of results that we're seeing in terms of who are the individuals who appear to be most susceptible to thinking in extreme and dogmatic ways that also support violence, even at that normative level. So first of all, we do find very consistently that people who perform poorly on tasks of cognitive flexibility, so those who are highly cognitively rigid on these non-political perceptual tasks, tend to also endorse ideological violence and ideological rigidity as well. So that is starting to show us that there are these parallels between the ways in which people are perceiving the world generally and the ways in which their cognitive and perceptual architecture is just engaging with the world around them, and how it then translates into how they kind of relate to ideological phenomena. And this is really relevant if you already read the Syndrome E, the first paper in '97. He was already talking about perseveration and considering how perseverative and compulsive behaviors might contribute to violent thought. So here we even see at the normative level that individuals who are highly cognitively rigid tend to kind of endorse ideological violence as well. We also find, we've been talking a lot about emotion, we do find that these individuals are emotionally dysregulated. They tend to be more impulsive, they tend to be more sensation seeking, so seeking of thrills and sensations. And that really makes sense when we think about the kind of individual who's willing to engage in violent collective action. We also see all sorts of perceptual impairments of these individuals when they're performing these kinds of psychological tasks, that the very way in which their minds are processing visual stimuli is not the same as individuals who are very resilient, very open-minded, very flexible and tolerant in their thinking. And we see a range of kind of dysfunctions or difficulties in dealing with complex cognition. So when they are required to process a lot of mental steps, simulate a lot of difficult mental kind of components, they struggle. And so that is starting to also hint at maybe people who naturally struggle with cognitively complex stimuli or complex planning and mental sequences, maybe they're more drawn to simplistic ideologies that offer absolutist descriptions of the world. And those are also the ones who promote violence later on. So thinking about that kind of transition from just having normative values to adhering to an ideology in a potentially extreme, strong, maybe violent degree, and then the actual actions, one of the things that we really need to think about is what pushes individuals along that spectrum, what kinds of contexts, what kind of biological dispositions, what kinds of experiences push people along that spectrum, and why are some people pushed more easily, and why are other people more resilient? And I think that is really pertinent when we're thinking about the Syndrome E and what it means to, in some sense, think about it as a clinical condition, and what does it mean to have subclinical symptoms of it. So the key questions that I think are worthy of discussion and further investigation is, first of all, the question, can we map out the extremists? What does it mean to map it out? Which is basically what all the talks today have been gearing towards. And part of that is the ethical, the political question of, should we try to map out what the extremist brain looks like? What does that knowledge give us? What kind of dangers does that knowledge pose? So a lot of important ethical questions when we're trying to figure out who are the brains that pull the trigger. Part of this is also about causality and unpacking what is sometimes called the chicken and egg problem in political neuroscience. So the question of what comes first. Is it that we have these psychological traits that predispose some people especially towards ideological violence? Or is it, on the other hand, that immersion in ideological environments shape cognition and brain in return? And I mean, it is likely and it is most feasible and plausible that it's a bidirectional relationship, but teasing apart those causal mechanisms and errors is very important. And finally, as others have echoed, how does this bear on our prevention or our support for people who are vulnerable at the individual level, who are vulnerable because of the nature of their contexts and communities, or because of societies undergoing particular kinds of conflict, particular kinds of scarcity that we know contributes to thinking in these ways? So coming back to Hannah Arendt's quote, thinking about how ideologies not only transform our world, they also transform our human nature, our human minds fundamentally, I think the question, the optimistic, constructive question now becomes, well, how can we craft a certain kind of resilience, both in the situational conditions that surround people as they are confronted with these potentially violent contexts, and also in their cognitive and neural characteristics? How can we promote resilience against violence and totalitarian thought? So thank you very much. I know that was a very brief tour and broad overview, but very welcome to ask questions. I'm happy to elaborate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leo. And I'm sure we are going to discuss later, because you've used the word extremist, although Isaac has pounded us with the idea that these people are not extremists, but eventually normal people. But this is for further discussion, whether they are extremists or not. And now, last but not least, Gretty Mirdal will give her comments and ideas concerning violence, values, and the brain across scientific cultures, which have already been mentioned before. Thank you, Gretty.
Thank you very much. The aim of the city of Paris and the 13 universities of the Paris area, when they decided to establish an Institute of Advanced Study in the French capital, was to strengthen the human and social sciences, les SHS, as they say in France. Interdisciplinarity was not a priority. The idea was to attract the best scholars and international researchers to Paris and to create a living, active, inspiring center for research in the humanities and social sciences. But very soon it became evident for us that some of the questions we were studying necessitated the collaboration of the natural sciences, especially the cognitive and neurosciences. We needed their input, and we believed, without false modesty, that we also had something to offer. Itzhak Fried was very courageous to put his hand in the mouth of the lion by accepting to become the first neuroscientist fellow at the Institute. He was most welcome as the inspiring person he is, but his work on syndrome E got a rather rough reception. For one thing, we were speaking different languages. Itzhak Fried was speaking brain, we were speaking mind. But what was the most provoking for the scholars that we were was the fact that mass violence was being presented in a medical context as a pathophysiological mechanism and with a potential use for predictive purposes. We must admit that researchers in the humanities and social sciences have been generally reluctant to take the neurosciences on board, especially regarding research on violence. Historians, sociologists, psychologists, and literary scholars have studied mass violence for decades. The literature on massacres, especially after the Second World War, is extremely rich. And we saw a danger that syndrome E could lead to the assumption that mass violence is primarily neurologically determined. And more practically, we feared that the neurosciences would shape the agenda of research on mass violence. I remember that in those years, we hardly received any applications at the European Research Council, the ERC, that did not include some kind of brain imaging, whether these cerebral measures were relevant or not. The fear that the neuroscientists would dominate the field and take it all was not totally unwarranted. At the Institute, we had heated discussions, even disputes, I would call them. But we managed to create the program on brain culture and society with Alain Berthoz as president and invaluable and very generous support. And the book that we are presenting today is one of the results of this interdisciplinary work. In the 10 minutes I have left, I'd like to give a few concrete examples of how the confrontation between the two cultures actually took place, and to describe what made the difference in generating new insights, modifying hypotheses, and formulating more pertinent research questions. In other words, shortly, questions where working together made sense and where not working together does not make sense. The first, in general, the research presented in the book supports the hypothesis that most perpetrators that commit mass murder do indeed manifest symptoms of syndrome E. This is Fried's original hypothesis. And that these symptoms that have been described characterize many perpetrators during the act of mass killing. That has been sort of supported by the different research. But some of the contributions in the book, among others, Christopher Browning's, who revisits his famous research on Battalion 101, point at the necessity of differentiating between the types of perpetrators and the different ways in which these contribute to the mass killings. Browning describes 5 categories: ideologues and true believers, experts, mild and lower echelon functionaries, party activists, face-to-face killers. It is the behavior of one segment of the face-to-face killers, the non-violent ordinary men who are transformed into killers, that concerns us today, the hypothesis of syndrome E. There were among them those who enjoyed the killings, those who did it with flat affect, and those who evaded. According to Browning, this differentiation should raise doubts about Fried's contention that most perpetrators respond uniformly with symptoms of syndrome E. That was one of the questions that we discussed, where one could say that it was a contribution of history to the neurosciences. Another venue of research was psychopharmacology, which contributed to refine our knowledge of possible brain processes. I will now very, very shortly touch upon this question on the similarity between syndrome E behavior and drug abuse. That Itzhak has already mentioned it in his talk. Several syndrome E symptoms resemble those of people who are under the effect of drugs. And these are, for example, compulsive repetitive violence, obsessive beliefs, desensitization to violence, and the like. There are 2 chapters in the book, Jean-Paul Tassins and Trevor Robbins, that suggest that the extreme violence used by terrorists exhibiting syndrome E behavior can be caused or at least exacerbated by drugs. This implies that the sudden transformation that Fried called, or that was called the killing switch, could, as in the case of drugs, also be due to shifts in the activity and creativity of a subgroup of neurons called modulatory neurons that are the specific targets of drug abuse. This is an important path to investigate further, both for the neural and neuroscientists, and for the sociopolitical scientists and scholars. The next question that where our interactions really gave sense is the importance of differentiating between traits, states, and what that means for prevention. Beranger, with other words, talked about traits and states. Are syndrome E behaviors, for example, lack of empathy, permanent personality traits, or transient states that perpetrators manifest in the latest phase of radicalization and during the killings? In Fried's original conception, this assumption was that the symptoms of syndrome E were personality traits. In other words, pre-existing vulnerabilities that could be identified prior to becoming violent. It has so far not been able to, we have not been able to identify such traits. And this touches intimately upon the question of whether syndrome E is the cause of violence. That's what we're talking about with the question of cause and effect, or whether it is simultaneously developed with the killings. And thereby the assumption that syndrome E can be prevented is very heavily challenged. The next theme or problem I'm going to touch upon or talk to you about is the question related to the affiliation of in-groups and out-groups as a trigger for syndrome E. Now, both Susan Fiske and many of you who have already spoken have touched upon this question. And I can't resist going back to Sigmund Freud, who talked about, I have these pictures of us in my, thank you. Freud wrote in 1920, a religion, even if it calls itself the religion of love, must be hard and unloving to those who do not belong to it. Fundamentally, indeed, every religion is the same way a religion of love for all those whom it embraces, while cruelty and intolerance toward those who do not belong to it are natural to every religion. Several chapters in the book provide us with biological evidence for Freud's assumption. Julie Grez and Jorge Armoni refer in their chapter to fMRI studies which have examined the brain correlates of group bias. A network of brain areas has been shown to be more activated when perceiving in groups compared to out group faces. Now that is in line with what Susan Fiske was telling us, and you will find more details in the book about the cerebral networks that are involved. Also, Scott Atran considered group-related factors as essential to radicalization and willingness to kill and to die. Atran has studied 3 consequences of strong group affiliations that can lead to syndrome E. Commitment to non-negotiable sacred values to which the group's actors are wholly fused. Readiness to forsake commitment to kin for those values. you're willing to sacrifice your parents, your mother, your children. And 3, perceived spiritual strength. You feel stronger by belonging to the in-group versus the foes. Finally, I'd like to talk about something that we have not worked on and that could possibly be the next steps of our transdisciplinary cooperation. It is words as triggers of violence. Leor has talked about ideology as triggers of violence. This is a step lower down the level. But Émile Bruno, who is no longer among us, conducted extensive research on the effect of collective blame, which is particularly pernicious in that it does not just loosen restrictions or harming others, it gives perpetrators a license to kill. In contexts where dehumanization and collective blame prevail, the two explain a large chunk of the variance in nearly all outcome measures, wrote Bruno. And I will close by quoting Otto Klemperer, 1947, The Language of the Third Reich. Language does not simply write and think for me. It also increasingly dictates my feelings and governs my entire spiritual being, the more unquestioningly and unconsciously I abandon myself to it. And what happens if the cultivated language is made up of poisonous elements or has been made the bearer of poisons? Words can be like tiny doses of arsenic. He didn't know of Captagon at the time. They are swallowed unnoticed, appear to have no effect, and then after a little time, the toxic reaction sets in after all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gretty, for this very thoughtful summary and also comments. And this concludes the formal speakers' expose. And now is time to ask our colleague Denis Paschansky, my co-chairman, if he would like kindly to give us some comments about what he heard, his views, and maybe how his experience concerning the very large study he made on the victims of the terrorist attacks and his general knowledge about this problem. What does it inspire to you? Denis, à toi.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. This meeting is absolutely fascinating, and I want to thank you to participate to these exchanges, and also to perhaps to explore these new tracks proposed by Gretty. But here, as we said in France, d'où tu parles, camarade? Where are you talking from, comrade? So it was a lot of decades ago. But I therefore an historian, a specialist of World War II, but also a specialist in memory sciences, to use an expression that with my friend as a neuropsychologist, with Francis Eustache, so we wish to put forward rather than memory studies. We are implementing a long-term transdisciplinary work and the memory of the terrorist attacks of November 13, 2015, as you know, and you say. So, however, what characterizes this meeting and this collective work is from my point of view, is the crucial importance of transdisciplinarity to apprehend the phenomenon and to understand what underlies its approach and his syndrome. So I will start from the case of the assassination, a matter of Samuel Paty, you know, who died simply for having fulfilled his role of as a teacher by reminding the principle of Republican secularism. So we're not a mixture between an extreme Islamist radicalization of segments of French society, the role of transmitters, I would almost say of neurotransmitters of the social networks, the action initiated by an individual, the Chechen perpetrator, with at the same time totally taken in a collective cultural and ideological framework, a real but limited network of mutual aid, and an individual conviction of the passage to the act. So we find all the, from my point of view, all the elements present in this book. So some specific questions, please, and for all of you. So first, I read, it's this shift from dehumanization to violence that is the alarming aspect leading to syndrome E. The greatest evil is reserved for the weakest, for those who belong to a group of outsiders with the lowest status in society. Susan, yes. So can we really generalize this? Let's think of the Jews in the Holocaust by bullets, because there was also a social hatred and revenge for the local peasants. You don't have to be at the bottom of the social ladder to suffer the worst. So it's rather what we could call the competition of proximity. Another development about makes of analysis, including molecule, genes, cells, circuits, psychology, behavior, and self-report. So about the RDOC and DSM, it's clear that there is a complementarity. The DSM providing a symptomatology. The RDOC seeming to me perfectly adapted to what we are doing within the framework of the November 13 program on PTSD. We could have some exchange about this question, but it's not the aim of my purpose. So the DSM seems to me to be upstream of the disciplinary question, but if the DOC responds perfectly to this transdisciplinary approach inside and between the life sciences, it seems to leave out the humanities and social sciences. So what do you think about this? So it seems to me that several contributions ask this question and find answers, as well as the cross-reflection of the phenomenologist, philosopher, and the neurobiologist, among others, who will be able to answer this. So question, what is the role of neurotransmitters, and in particular GABAergic, on which we are beginning to work to understand the effects and functioning of PTSD, but beyond that. So another factor to be analyzed, is a social position. I would have just like to stress the importance of the notion of cognitive fracture proposed by Itzhak Fried. As a concrete case, he evokes the example of Rwanda, where the Hutu is unable to kill his own animals, but will massacre Tutsis. So it's very interesting to illustrate this dissociation at work from a simple example, but is it not a difference in representation? Wouldn't the Tutsi become below the beast in the process at play? Another question that is more a neuroscience issue. I read, in addition to, because I read the book, so an extract, in addition to PFC hyperexcitation, syndrome E is characterized by amygdala deactivation, which is responsible for emotional flatness and lack of fear. So for me, it's a little surprising. It's very interesting, but surprising, because is amygdala totally inhibited or focused on other emotional reactions? I wonder about the functioning of the amygdalo-hippocampal complex, and not only with the amygdala. So this preeminence of the PFC, which stifles the amygdala, may seem counterintuitive as feeling of revenge and fear for the life of one's own group, may suggest an overactivation of the amygdala. And one absence, but perhaps you have work about that, the hippocampus. All the more interesting, it seems to me that according to Layton and Krikorian's scheme, I'm sure you know it, is after a common progression and increasing excitation of the amygdala is accompanied by an inhibition of the hippocampus. So what about encoding at the time of the act and its immediate aftermath? Another question that concerns pharmacology more directly. The use of drugs, such as Captagon and so on. What is very interesting in that the perpetrators of November 13, they didn't use such drugs. So here again, how can we distinguish between conditions sine qua non for the passage to the act and factors favoring it? Empathy and sympathy now, another crucial issue. Against the idea that syndrome E will be a matter of nature alone, outside of cultural frameworks, the breakdown of empathy would be a transitory state linked to specific social, historical conditions. Okay. I heard. So I regularly repeat, namely the irreducibility, of the event. And even happens, I can explain it perfectly after the fact, including by describing it in the long term. The opposite happens. I would be just as capable to explain it. So it seems to me that we too often neglect the absence of fatality in history. And I think that this applies to human beings. So to conclude, yes, almost all of you are asking the question, what is the part of the individual and his own or her own reactions, and what is the part of the social context? So to finish, I return the question to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci, Denis. Itzhak, do you want to answer to Denis' comments before we give the floor to questions? Your microphone.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think, obviously, there were quite a few questions raised here, and I'm not sure, I'll take the time to answer all, but I do want to actually comment on the issue of our doc, and I think we absolutely agree. In fact, I think we have covered this in the book, and it was a main issue that we dealt with, the issue of DSM, 5 or whatever DSM of the future versus RDoc. And definitely the RDoc is really the right frame to really deal with it, in the sense that in the RDoc you have units of analysis in the general case, gene, molecule, cell, circuits, physiology, behavior, and even self-report. Right? So all these, some of these are actually present in our analysis. You know, we obviously have dealt, you know, of the self-report, of the observation of behavior, to an extent also in physiology, cells and circuits. Pharmacology is really dealing with the issue of molecules, okay? In terms of domains, you know, we really looked at emotions and we looked at cognitive systems and any psychological construct, which are mainly dehumanization, empathy, and agency. I think this is really, you know, the only approach feasible. So I totally agree with you on that aspect. You know, I think maybe we'll just open it now so other people can also comment and we can hear also, you know, other questions, Alain, any way that you want to handle it. Yeah. Oh, you are mute now, Alain.
OK. Simon, est-ce qu'on peut avoir maintenant des questions, s'il vous plaît?
Okay, so we have one question that is more for Patrick. It's about chains of command involving a sequence of order. What about them? What about chains of command involving a sequence of orders? Wouldn't they nearly dissolve the sense of responsibility altogether?
Yeah, great question. Thank you very much. So traditionally in military hierarchies, this is supposed to work in a quite structured and organized way. So traditionally in a military system, the officer commands and the soldier obeys. And that means that the soldier doesn't really make free choices. They are coerced. But the counterpart of that arrangement is that the officer is responsible for the consequences of the action, not the soldier. That is the sort of theory. And that led us to do, or Emily Kaspar, to do experiments where we looked at, if you have three people, a coercive experimenter, an agent, and a quote victim, unquote. We know that the agent doesn't feel a sense of agency when they perform an action that has a bad outcome for the so-called victim. So we hypothesized that maybe the responsibility somehow transfers from the agent to the person who gave the orders. And we started measuring the intentional binding effect in participants who played the role of the experimenter, which is equivalent to being the officer in a military hierarchy. But actually, they don't seem to experience much sense of agency over the bad outcomes either. So this idea that somehow responsibility is passed along the chain of command, I mean, that works in terms of the actual military process of getting the command from the center to the place of action. So it works, if you like, in terms of actual factual agency, but in terms of sense of agency, in terms of who experiences responsibility, it doesn't work in quite the same way. So I think I'm sort of feeling that maybe chains of responsibility, in fact, dilute the subjective responsibility, even though they might successfully transfer the kind of operational responsibility. They might dilute the sense of responsibility. That's my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Patrick, may I question you concerning, before I give the floor to Sadi, who had a question, can I ask you to maybe say a few more words about what you name coercive behavior, la coercition?
Yeah.
Since in the book, we have a very interesting chapter by Étienne Quéclin, who has proposed a theory that the lateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved with setting rules, word we have not heard this afternoon, can eventually inhibit the medial temporal cortex, who is involved eventually with values.
Yeah.
And we have not heard very much this afternoon the word inhibition. As you know, I have an addiction to inhibition, disinhibition system as important in the brain as activation. But in that case, coercion does not concern agentivity as such, but it's just inhibition of the attribution of value. What do you think of that?
I think there is a link. So the medial frontal system, which you've called the value system, is also the system which allows you to choose endogenously an action according to your subjective preferences. So it can also be thought of a system for volitional choice as opposed to cued instruction, whereas the lateral prefrontal cortical system is capable, for example, of learning contextual mappings. So I always think of the lateral system as being able to guide our actions according to rules like green means go and red means stop. And this is, of course, a very, very useful rule in social social cohabitation in urban societies. That's why we're able to use cars and bicycles without killing each other. But I think the important point about the medial frontal cortex is that you use your subjective evaluation of the different alternatives rather than an externally imposed link to action or a potential action meaning. So that would be my argument. What then is coercion? Well, coercion would be anything which reduces your autonomous choice. So anything which restricts your ability to choose, quote, freely, unquote, among alternatives, and anything which guides your choices. So at that point, really all stimuli are slightly coercive, and people telling you, you must press that button, are just a very explicit and very sort of canonical form of coercion.
Okay, thank you. Sadi, and then we will ask one more question from the floor.
Yeah, that was also for that coercion issue. Patrick, you concluded in a way of saying that coercion undermines social responsibility and dilutes it, and I would completely agree on that, and on what you just said. But there have been also very interesting variants of the Milgram experiment by Meus and Radmakers, right? That you know, the Utrecht experiment on administrative violence. And then it was not about authority or coercion. It was about some kind of a contract that the subject would take with the experimenters. And so what happened is that in a way, when you make a contract, you acknowledge the new status and what you have to do. So it's a matter of rules and not a matter of coercion. And this also goes with another effect in time, that is dissonance. And I mean, humans want to align what they believe and what they do. And if they're forced into doing something, whether by rules or coercion or authority or by imitation or whatever, at some point they have the choice. If this does not align with their beliefs, either they stop doing it or they change their beliefs. And pretty often what we see is that people start to endorse, right, the ideology that in the beginning forced them to do or induced them to do something more or less unwillingly. And so this is why all this thing is interesting, that once people have started doing it, something changes, perhaps in the brain, perhaps in the way they categorize their action or the targets, perhaps in their relationship with the group, because now you've been initiated into doing something, you're part of it. And so the whole installation gets stronger and stronger as it is reinforced by your action. And so there's a vicious circle in this, that then actions are aligned with thoughts and with the group, and you know, everything flows, and it's very difficult to stop that thing. Sorry. Yep.
Do you want me to try to reply? I think that's a really interesting idea.
No,
I was very excited by your concept of a tipping point. And what you just said was more like a continuous slope, but I think the first time does seem to be very important. So I think that seems like an interesting potential area for future research. When you mentioned contracts, I thought that was quite interesting, because a contract is in a sense coercive, right? You're bound by it, but you voluntarily enter into it. And there's a really interesting way in which our societies have sort of dealt with or changed volition to allow these kinds of contracts. And what you were saying reminded me of a really interesting issue in legal responsibility. Why are you legally responsible for something you do when you're highly intoxicated? So let's suppose I get completely drunk and I don't know what I'm doing and I punch somebody in the face. And of course I hurt them. And obviously we want to hold me responsible for doing such a horrible thing. And the way that the law does that is by a concept of so-called prior fault. So the voluntary act that I made, which was wrong, was opening the bottle and having the first drink. Because I knew that this would then lead to me becoming intoxicated, and then I might get into a fight and cause this harm. So this idea that you have these sort of chains of action, which have these consequences, which you're able to understand, and therefore are able to still deploy your volition on, even though the volition is displaced from the moment of action, I think are rather similar to your concept of contract. And in that sense, I would say that contracts are coercive, but we agree to be coerced.
That's the very nature of society. We are
society is like that,
doing these things.
Yep. It's a profound truth about society.
To avoid violence. Yep.
Sorry, we have to give the audience some chance. You plenty of time to discuss in the IEA, right? Okay. I'm sorry to be such a coercive chairman.
But people want to be
right? So, Simon, please.
Yeah, thank you for the audience. We actually have two interesting questions by former fellows of the Institute, Italian former fellows. The first one is for Leo, but I guess it's also for other speakers and maybe among them Sadi. What's the impact of education on extremism?
I think that's a fascinating question, because part of all we're discussing here is about the developmental trajectory of what brings a person to that tipping point or that repetition, also all the rituals that contribute to why people are able to commit such actions. So I guess I have 2 points to break about that. So the first about education and kind of the relationship between psychology and ideology or extremism. All of the kind of methods that we use, all the analyses that we use, always control for things like educational attainment, demographic things like gender and age. So they're all consistent and they're all present even after we account for education. However, that's not to say that we know that these psychological domains are very malleable, they're very flexible, and so they can be enhanced or trained or kind of made more resilient. And I think the interesting question is what kind of education and at what point in time to citizens. Obviously children, it's the most vulnerable period, but we would also like to be able to have citizens that we can educate to be tolerant and open-minded and against violence. So what kind of education would that be? Would that be about critical thinking? Would that be about promoting flexibility? Would that be about promoting perspective taking or theory of mind and all those things that contribute towards humanization rather than dehumanization? So I think it's a great question. I have some longitudinal work on that, but that's for another day.
Well, I just, with that respect, Alain, I just wanted to raise one more issue, because essentially the issue of education and ideology, it all comes to the issue of information. Now, all the methods of propagation of information, consumption of information, have really changed, right? So the question is, to what extent, is the current modes of propagation of information, I mean, can you quarantine yourself? And I'm using this, by intention. Can you quarantine yourself from information? To what extent are we all stuck in one room, where we are essentially susceptible to contagion, right? How does the present age really affect, syndrome E?
So,
can anybody undertake this question? Or?
Yeah, very nice. I would like to myself make a comment on the question which was asked concerning the role of education. I have proposed that there is a crucial age somewhere between 8 to pre-puberty, which was already said by Piaget to be an age which was fundamental for understanding, for changing point of view. And I have proposed the idea that there is a cognitive critical period in the biological sense for acquisition of the capacity of tolerance in this frame of age. If it is a critical period, it would mean that if children of this age are shut down into a single ideology or into a single view of others, they may have further difficulties and become fanatics. And this is what has happened over history. It was the case of the young Hitlerian soldiers, as you know. It has been the case in Uganda. It's the case all over the world now, that the terrorists recruit children at this particular age, between 9 to 12, brainwash them, and then they can do anything with them afterwards. And so I'd like just to mention that I've been fighting also, not fighting, but trying to get in the Institute of Human Rights some specific protection for children for the acquisition of what I call the right to change point of view at this particular age. It's also done in the jihadists today. They pick up and they steal children at this age. And so I just wanted to say that I think there is among all problems of education, there is this particular thing. It's just a little comment. So, une autre question, Simon?
Yeah, so it's more a question for Patrick. It's related to command hierarchy. The military example seems to be a situation where responsibility gets diluted, so neither the soldier nor the officer feels responsibility for a negative or violent outcome. But how about the experience of those who, by contrast, feel vicariously responsible for the outcomes of action that they did not personally perform? For example, parents who feel responsible for their children's behaviors. In this case, we can have sense of responsibility without sense of agency, maybe.
Really interesting point. A number of studies have noted the astonishing variability in the age of criminal responsibility across different jurisdictions. I can't remember all the details. In United Kingdom, children under 10 are not criminally responsible. I can't remember, I think in several countries in Europe, it's 18. Some countries, I think, don't really have any concept of there being an age of responsibility in quite the same way. But there isn't one age, that's really clear. And that, I think, hints at the point that there are many sort of social traditions and cultural factors which govern the idea of responsibility for the actions of others. I was recently told by my friend and colleague Valérian Chambon about a really interesting legal debate in ancient Rome regarding the responsibilities of slaves. So if you were a rich Roman citizen, you might have a slave, and the slave was an object that you owned. And if the slave then committed some crime, let's say the slave punches somebody in the face, who is responsible? Is the slave responsible, or are you responsible, given that the slave is merely an object and has no legal status and is effectively reduced to the level of a tool? So are you responsible for not controlling the slave? So this concept was called noxal abandonment and was quite heavily discussed in legal theory in Roman law. I don't know much more than that, but I think the case of children is perhaps slightly analogous, and I think I'd hesitate to make an expert comment on it, but I think it's really striking how some parents do feel a sense of responsibility for what their children do and others don't. So I suspect it's a very strongly culturally mediated practice.
Simon, any question more?
No more question.
Okay.
May I put some question?
Yes, please, Denis.
1 or 2 minutes. Yeah. I've put a question about hippocampus, Itzhak. I have some information, and you, Alain, and other, if in case, about the impact on hippocampus, the role of memory, and so on, because we are working on that, and it's absolutely crucial. It's only on
I think
at the end of the process.
One thing is really the ability to assimilate new information, right? Because the hippocampus is where you will assimilate new information. So one of the characteristic of the symptoms is really that inflexibility in assimilating new information. For instance, the death marches at the end of World War II, right? They all knew and they assimilated maybe the information, but they didn't really, that the war is lost. Yet, they continued essentially. So they were unable to really assimilate new information and act on it. So it probably has to do with fronto-hippocampal relationship, or the ability, to really assimilate hippocampal information into action. But I think obviously it's something that we cannot directly study. We can only make a hypothesis of what is happening.
There is of inhibition,
yeah.
Okay. So,
and also I wanted to read what a letter we have included in Caen Memorial. The great memorial in France dealing with World War II. It's a letter in which an SS officer recounted a massacre in which he had participated in the morning in a village. He was shooting as in a bat trap at babies thrown into the air by his colleagues. And his justification was, if we had not done it later as adults, they would have come to kill our children or grandchildren. So it's only a justification of perhaps a place of revenge in the process of you have described. The process you have described of syndrome or not.
Itzhak.
Yeah, well, I think this kind of justification was common, I guess, in the sense that they said, "Why are you killing children?" Well, they will become, in 20 years, they may become an enemy of the Reich, right? So, again, I think it's the effect of ideology in a sense, and the question is, what Gretty mentioned: words are really toxic. Eventually they're assimilated into an ideology, which justifies action. But obviously it's a highly, abnormal situation. We do have an aversion to throwing babies in the air. It is clear. Yet here, the rules are able to really override, this value system.
But you have understood it's not in a trial. It's 2 or 3 days after, in a letter written to his wife.
These letters, and photos which were taken and sent home, were essentially part of that ideology. It wasn't just a momentary thing. It was a state. I mean, he could send all these things to his wife. He can love, his own babies. He can, shudder from killing a dog, but yet he's able to do this to a baby, because the baby is an object. The object is a threat to him by the ideology. So he has no problem in doing that. But that's a major transformation. We have to find an explanation for it. But I think it's all this combination of elements, of seeing the baby as an object, of having a justification, of maybe not feeling the responsibility. I mean, all those things which we mentioned here about, agency, responsibility, perception, theory of mind, all this really come to one point. You throw a baby in the air, right? Or you throw a baby against a wall, something that, a quote, normal person would never do, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. We are coming very close to the end. And of course, we have not been able to summarize for our audience all which is in the book, which has been published now, or as we have seen, the incredible complexity of the problems that we've been talking about. I just wanted to show you, for the audience which may be interested, a book which appeared last year, because we have spoken about identity and denial. This is called L'Identité. It's an encyclopedia which has been written under the direction of the regretted philosopher Jean Gaillon, who unfortunately died 2 years ago. This has been written by more than 100 participants. It's a kind of dictionary on identity with contributions from people of very, very different disciplines, from neuroscience, biology, philosophy, etc. So that may be interesting because we had this discussion. And I would like to thank everybody who participated, and maybe give the last word to Gretty Mirdal, who was the organizer of this adventure that we all participated, and thank her very much. Gretty, you will have the last word for that.
Thank you very much. I think it has been a fascinating experience to listen to all of you, and still leaving the round table with a feeling of hunger for more, a feeling of not having dealt into all the questions that we must go back to and still work on. And maybe that is really the best way to feel after such a conference, that you want to meet again, you want to do more work, you want to hear more research, and together. I am convinced that we could not have done it, neither us who were interested from the humanities point of view, who had read all the literature on the Holocaust and lived with it. When you came, you made a difference for our understanding of what we knew. And I hope that we made a difference for you, Itzhak, on the way in which you now conceive Syndrome E and the impossibility of doing prevention on the basis of what you started with.